Hello and welcome to the first in this series of short podcasts in which I'll be giving some tax and other practical advice for families. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Claire Charlton and I am head of the personal tax team at Rycroft Glenton. In the course of my work, I often deal with families who are assisting an elderly relative with finances or who are sadly dealing with a bereavement. And there are a number of tips, I suppose, that I would give to families in order to make those processes easier. And so the purpose of this podcast is to pass on some of those tips. I've entitled this first episode, Do You Know Your Grandmother's Maiden Name? And the reason for that is because of something that happened to me personally. My mother had made a supermarket online order and for various reasons was indisposed and not able to accept the order. So she asked me to cancel it for her and she gave me her login details and password for the supermarket account. And I duly logged on, but because I logged on my own iPad and not on my mum's laptop, it started to ask me a number of security questions, one of which was, what's your mother's maiden name? Now, at this point, obviously, I'm pretending to be my mother, so I needed to know her mother's maiden name, and I completely failed on that question. I was also asked a number of other questions about name of first pet and primary school, and I couldn't answer any of them, so I had to abandon the project. But it did get me thinking, on a more serious note, that there could be a situation in which I would need to access my mum's online bank accounts, her utility accounts, her insurance, and those sorts of things. And really, I had no idea how to do that. So we've spent some time recently sorting all of that out so that I am able to access her various accounts should she be unable to do so for any reason. Now, I think some of the banks and so on are becoming increasingly concerned about this, and certainly Apple, I believe, have recently announced that they'll be adding a digital legacy service for their users so that you can assign an administrator to access your data in the event that you're unable to do so. And that would involve setting up the administrator with an access key so that they could see your password protected data. Although I believe it won't enable your administrator to see things like stored credit cards, etc. But it does sound as if it would be a very useful service, and I assume Microsoft will follow suit. So I do suggest as a very minimum that you discuss these matters within your family and make sure that at least one other person in your family or a trusted friend has access to your online accounts and indeed knows where you keep important documents such as your will, the name of your solicitor, funeral wishes, that sort of thing. And just taking this idea a step further, what I often come across in the event of a death is that the solicitor will contact me and ask me about assets that I'm aware of from doing the tax return of the deceased. But I'm not always aware of other assets, non-income producing assets or non-taxable assets such as ISAs, premium bonds, life assurance policies. And again, I recommend that an up-to-date list of those assets is kept with personal papers to make life easier for your family. The next thing I'd like to talk about is gifts, because gifts that are made in the 7 years leading up to a death need to be identifiable for your executors so that they can determine whether those gifts are covered by various reliefs and allowances or if they need to be declared for inheritance tax purposes. And clearly, reviewing your bank statements for 7 years is quite an undertaking and can be quite costly if it has to be done by a professional person. And so what I recommend is that you keep a running record of gifts you have made during your lifetime with a note of the date and the amount and the name of the recipient of the gift. And again, keep that with your personal papers. There are some valuable inheritance tax reliefs that can be obtained in relation to gifts if the right records are kept. And I'm going to be talking in one of the later podcasts in this series about a particularly valuable relief which involves making gifts from your surplus income and the paperwork that needs to be kept in order to evidence such gifts. So do look out for that later podcast if that's something you'd be interested in. And my final tip for today is in relation to record keeping for married couples. So for a widow or widower who has sadly been predeceased by their spouse, it's important to keep a copy of the will relating to the first spouse to have died, along with the papers of the surviving spouse. And the reason for that is that the executors dealing with the estate on second death will need to refer to those papers in determining whether there are any transferable inheritance tax reliefs available on the second death. That is quite a complex area of tax, and so if you would like some further advice on that, please do get in touch. So to summarise, I hope I've been able to give you a few practical tips on record keeping, simple things that can be done to help families dealing with potentially difficult situations, which will hopefully make things that little bit easier. If you would like to discuss any of the issues I've raised in this podcast, then please do contact me. My details are shown on the front photograph that you clicked on to listen to this podcast. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join me for future podcasts in this series.